Wow, what an event. What a star-studded evening. Before going forward, it behooves me to give a glowing acknowledgement and praise. In Hebrew, we call it hakaras hatov, to the organizers of this year's Canadian Jewish Book Awards. Every year for the last 2 decades, I've attended and participated in the awards, and every year the program gets better and better. Where else in Canada could one come face to face with the diverse celebrities and the glamorous personalities present here tonight? We are all witnesses to history. On this very podium, we witness the outstanding courage of Tareq Fatah, the entertaining comedic genius of Michael Lex, the glamour of presenters like the next one, the elegant Dorothy Shoichet, and the erudite Professor Adam Furstenberg, who started it all. And we're all familiar with the most famous work of Professor Troper, namely None is Too Many, which he co-authored with Irving Abella. But how many of us knew before you read the program that None is Too Many, the story of the Canadian government's refusal to allow Jewish immigration from Europe during the Holocaust, was selected as one of the 100 most important Canadian books ever written, as chosen by a panel of experts for the Literary Review of Canada. Wikipedia tells us that Harold Troper is the author of several other books, including The Ransomed of God, The Secret Rescue of the Jews of Syria, also Old Wounds, Jews, Ukrainians, and the Hunt for Nazi War Criminals in Canada. He's a professor of education at the University of Toronto. Current research interests include Canadian social history, immigration, education of ethnic and minority groups, American history, and the history of education. In his scholarly, insightful, and well-written work, The Defining Decade, Identity, Politics, and the Jewish Community in the 1960s, Harold Troper has told the definitive story of Canadian Jewry during the 1960s, but he also illuminates important changes that were occurring throughout non-Jewish Canadian society and in the neighboring American Jewish community. The Defining Decade presents a nuanced portrait of one ethnic community's evolving self-perception. There are chapters reflecting the different reactions in Quebec, Ontario, and the Western provinces. And this compelling history is presented with energy, clarity, and purpose. This unique work is unquestionably a major contribution to the study of Canadian Jewry. We congratulate Harold Troper on his outstanding work and are proud to recognize his achievement with our Abe and Faye Bergel Award in Scholarship on a Jewish subject.
Coming up here is obviously a big step. Thank you, Ryan. This is a true honor, and I mean all the more so because I am in the company of such a remarkable group of authors. And I must say that I don't say that out of false modesty. I like to think that I live by the old Yiddish adage, mach dich nicht so klein, du bist nicht so groß. Don't make yourself so small, you're not that big. And I am not that big, but the 1960s were, at least to me. The Defining Decade is an examination, as you were told, of the Canadian Jewish community during the 60s and early 70s. It's a decade, as we all know, that's popularly thought of as the swinging 60s, an era of youthful exuberance. But I argue that there's also a parallel Canadian-Jewish 1960s, a 1960s that remade what it meant to be a Canadian Jew. In fact, I argue the Canadian Jewish community that entered the 1960s has little or no resemblance to the community that exited the 1960s. And if you'll indulge me for a moment, or for a couple of moments, I'd like to recall a few of the shaping events, domestic and foreign, that impacted the Canadian Jewish community and probably impacted an awful lot of our own lives. There was the eruption of the Quiet Revolution, with its spillover of nationalism and separatism, which eventually led to the election of the Parti Québécois and the migration of more than 35,000 Jews out of Montreal to Toronto. Do we have any Montrealers in here? What did they say? Bill 101 equals Highway 401. And the 1960s also saw the election of Trudeau, an event I argue that accelerated the status revolution taking place among Canadian Jews. More than just championing the notion of multiculturalism, Trudeau enabled an unprecedented opening of Ottawa to Jews. Ministers, deputy ministers, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And as I detail in this book, all these impacted the private sector as well. As a man I interviewed put it, when a Jew was appointed Deputy Minister of Finance, the banks started installing kosher kitchens. And what about events outside of Canada? 50 years ago last week, on May the 23rd, 1961, Ben Gurion rose in the Knesset and announced the capture of Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann's capture and subsequent trial cemented the Holocaust into Canadian Jewish consciousness as no other event. And it also elevated the Holocaust survivor community in Canada out of the shadows and into the mainstream of community life. This in a Canada that had proportionally more Holocaust survivors than any other country, with the possible exception of Israel. How ironic then that only a few years after the Toronto community witnessed the Eichmann trial, that the same community was rocked by an outburst of street-level neo-Nazism. But signaling a new Jewish activism that I detail in the book, neo-Nazi provocations in Toronto were met by a pushback. As some of you remember, that included a confrontation in Allen Gardens that turned into a riot. But perhaps most searing of all 1960s events for Canadian Jews was the 1967 Six-Day War. And most critically, the several weeks that preceded that war. It was then that Canadian Jews were afflicted with Holocaust-like fears that Israeli annihilation was in the offing, in a mass anxiety attack that Lucy Davidovich describes, and I quote, as a reliving of the Holocaust. Canadian Jews, seeing their destiny entwined with that of Israel, rallied behind the beleaguered state. Like emotional whiplash, just as Canadian Jews shared pre-war angst, I also point out they shared post-war exuberance. Now deeply invested in Israel, they reaped a harvest of Jewish self-pride. Many I interviewed spoke of a new bounce in the Jewish step, and as I explained, for the organized Jewish community, the Six-Day War surged through the institutional arteries like adrenaline. It pumped up fundraising, it set off a tide of Jewish ethnotourism to Israel. Aliyah sparked. There was a sharp increase in Jewish communal activism, and Jewish day school attendance jumped. In the wake of the war, Jewish students began to press for Jewish studies at universities, and the Soviet Jewry campaign exploded as a community priority. And Holocaust commemoration expanded and did assertive Jewish lobbying on behalf of Jewish and Israeli issues. and at least temporarily, the Jewish community stood united, at least in its outward appearance. Sadly, as we know, there was also a downside. Barely had the grounds grown silent, and Israel and its Canadian Jewish supporters began to wrestle with the implications of victory itself, including the issues swirling around Israel's occupation, not just of land, but of people who didn't want to be under Israeli rule. All this is recounted in the defining decade, and all this still hangs out for us to see. Permit me to close with a personal note. If the story told in the defining decade is now history, it's my history. Like I suspect, like many of you this evening, I lived this decade. And as much as anything else, I wrote this book in the hope that those of you like me who lived through the 1960s might have a richer understanding of Canada and the community that we are a part of. If you read the book, an invitation, feel free to give me a call and we'll talk about it. Thank you.